Welcome, everyone. Today, we will explore the fascinating topic of the Madhabs and Usul al-Fiqh. I'm excited to guide you through this journey. On this first slide, you'll see the title of our presentation, which is The Madhabs with a focus on Usul al-Fiqh. We'll be covering the origins, principles, and differences of the main Islamic schools of thought, as well as the foundational principles that guide Islamic jurisprudence. Let's get started and dive into this enriching subject together. During the period of the righteous caliphs, there was only one madhab, or school of thought. This unified approach to fiqh helped maintain consistency and prevented the emergence of new madhabs that weren't linked to the state until much later. The word madhab actually comes from the Arabic root, zahaba, which means to go, so it signifies the path of ideas or opinions followed by scholars. Now, it's important to understand that someone who follows only one madhab is often associated with sectarianism. Historically, this kind of strict adherence could lead to divisions within the Muslim community, which is something we want to avoid because it threatens the unity and purity of Islam. Both extreme sectarianism and complete rejection of madhabs are serious threats. The Prophet, peace be upon him, emphasized the value of following the righteous generation, saying that the best generation is his and those who follow them, as recorded in Sahih Bukhari. This shows us the importance of balanced understanding and respect for different scholarly opinions. On the other hand, someone who totally rejects the madhabs tends to lean toward extremism and deviation, which can lead away from the balanced path of Islam. It's also crucial to remember that fiqh isn't determined by any single school acting alone. Instead, it's a collective effort, drawing on the strengths and insights of various schools of thought to arrive at a comprehensive understanding. So, the key takeaway here is that maintaining unity in fiqh and respecting diverse scholarly opinions helps preserve the integrity and solidarity of our faith. Let's talk about madhabs, or schools of Islamic legal thought. So, what exactly are madhabs? These are different schools or traditions that interpret and apply Islamic law, or fiqh. They developed over time as a way to understand and practice Islam more systematically. Now you might wonder, how and why did these madhabs come into existence? Well, back in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Islamic law wasn't written down or organized into schools yet. Islam hadn't spread far and wide, so everything was learned directly from the Prophet himself. People observed his actions, his sayings, and his judgments, and they copied him. When people had questions or needed guidance, they would consult the Prophet. He would give advice, issue rulings, and make judgments based on what was best and most just. He would praise good actions and disapprove of bad ones, setting a clear example for everyone. As Islam spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula and more people embraced it, the need to understand and apply Islamic law grew. People traveled great distances to learn directly from the Sahaba, the Prophet's companions, because he had passed away, and they wanted to continue learning from those who had been closest to him. So these schools of thought didn't just appear out of nowhere. They developed as a natural response to the expansion of Islam and the need to interpret and apply its teachings in different contexts. This is how the madhabs came into being, through a combination of direct learning from the Prophet and the efforts of scholars to understand and implement Islamic law for diverse communities. Let's explore how the companions of the Prophet, Piba, interpreted certain practices differently. For example, some considered certain acts permissible, while others thought they were desirable. Since the Prophet Piba was no longer alive, and there were no recorded sayings or actions for every matter, they often relied on their personal opinions. As they spread into different towns, many of these companions became leaders in their communities. When people in their areas approached them for advice on various issues, each companion responded based on what they remembered or had heard about the Prophet's teachings. However, if they couldn't recall any specific guidance from the Prophet, Piba, on a matter, they would use ijtihad, meaning their own legal reasoning, drawing from the Quran and Sunnah to give a verdict. They always tried their best to find the correct law or ruling wherever they could. But sometimes, they couldn't find a clear answer, which led to differences of opinion among them. For example, one companion might have heard of a ruling and based his judgment on it, while another, who hadn't heard that ruling, would do his best to decide based on the Quran and Sunnah. A good illustration is Abd Allah ibn Masud, who was asked about a woman whose husband had died and who hadn't fixed her mahr, the bridal money given at marriage. He said, "I didn't see the Prophet Piba giving a judgment on this matter." Still, people kept coming to him for a month, urging him to find an answer. So he used ijtihad, his own legal reasoning, based on the Quran and Sunnah to give a verdict. This shows how the companions sought guidance diligently, but when they couldn't find a clear answer, they used their judgment within the framework of Islamic sources. If a debate took place between the companions, where they had different opinions, and a trustworthy hadith emerged that clarified the matter, then they would happily withdraw their own ruling. They would never override the Prophet's Piba guidance. For example, Abu Hurairah believed that if someone got up in the morning in a state of ritual impurity, his fast would be invalid. But he held this view only until he was told otherwise, by some of the Prophet's Piba wives, that this was actually disagreeing with the Prophet Piba. So, he withdrew his opinion. It's important to understand that opinions or ijtihad, which is legal reasoning, were only used when there was no clear guidance from the Quran or Sunnah. Whenever a hadith is revealed, every Muslim must prioritize what divine revelation says over personal opinions or interpretations. Now, other differences arose when people saw the Prophet Piba do something and interpreted it as Sunnah, while others did not see it the same way. For instance, during the Al-Nafar journey, the Prophet Piba stopped at the Al-Abtah Valley for a break, an optional practice for pilgrims. Abu Hurairah and Ibn Umar saw this as part of the Sunnah, while Aisha and Ibn Abbas did not. These differences often occur because of various reasons: different interpretations, misunderstandings, assumptions, hearing half of a hadith, or relying on unreliable sources. It's natural that Muslims might have different viewpoints, but the key is always to prioritize authentic divine guidance when it is available. As we see on this slide, the view or madhab of the companions started to differ over time. This led followers to learn different opinions from among the companions themselves. As a result, they would remember and follow whatever they heard of the hadith and the views of the companions, often trying to reconcile conflicting or inconsistent opinions as much as possible. Sometimes, the views of certain companions were given preference over others, which contributed to the formation of distinct schools of thought. This is essentially how the madhabs, or legal schools, were born. It's important to understand that people back then didn't have the easy access to research and resources we have today. They relied heavily on the companions and learned scholars for answers to their questions. These learned people did their best, and when they didn't have a clear answer, they would make a ruling based on what they felt was most appropriate, always trying to stay in line with the Quran and Sunnah. Over time, many scholars contributed their legal reasoning, which led to the development of various madhabs. While many schools emerged, the four main madhabs that most people follow today are Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali. When these four scholars or schools provided different rulings on the same issue, they gathered followers around them, and naturally, differences and even sects emerged. This historical process shows how rich and diverse our Islamic legal tradition is, all rooted in sincere efforts to understand and implement the teachings of Islam. These four madhabs were all founded by very learned people. They did their best to find answers before giving their own interpretation. They traveled far and endured many hardships, extreme heat, limited resources, and difficult conditions to seek direct answers and learn about Islam. It's important to remember that these scholars have said that if any of their work ever conflicts with the Quran or Sunnah, people must disregard it. The madhab does not take precedence over the Quran or Hadith. Sadly, many people have not followed this guidance. Muslims believe we are required to follow one school of thought and do so sincerely. However, this can sometimes lead us away from the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who told us to follow his example. He said, "Do as I do," which means we need to follow his ways directly. If we don't find a clear answer in the Quran or Sunnah, then we should look for the school of thought that most closely aligns with them. It's also important to understand that not all madhabs are always perfectly right. Sometimes one school is closer to the Quran and Sunnah, and other times, another might be. That's why we need to be diligent in understanding which is more accurate at any given time. Ultimately, we follow the Prophet, peace be upon him, not just a scholar, imam, or madhab. The scholars are there to help us understand. We're encouraged to ask questions, but we must evaluate who provides the better evidence, who's closer to the true interpretation of the Quran and Hadith, even if that means listening to someone we don't particularly like. Our goal is to adhere to the Prophet's teachings and not merely follow a specific school of thought blindly. During the era of the Prophet Muhammad, Piba, the development of Islamic law, or fiqh, was primarily guided by him and his ijtihads, which are reasoned rulings based on his understanding. Additionally, the Sahaba, his companions, contributed to shaping these rulings through their own efforts. At that time, the Quran and Sunnah were the only sources of Islamic law, serving as the foundational texts for all legal rulings. Importantly, there was only one school of thought, which we can refer to as the madhab of the Prophet, Piba. This unified approach helped maintain consistency in legal understanding during that early period. However, as we move into the early Umayyad dynasty, we see the beginning of divisions among fiqh scholars. This marked the start of two main madhabs, distinguished by their approach to ijtihad, namely, al-Ari, which emphasizes personal reasoning, and al-Hadith, which adheres strictly to textual sources. Over time, these two madhabs evolved further, especially when the caliph or king was no longer the central authority overseeing them. Scholars and students spread across the vast Islamic state, and their diverse ijtihads began to produce a variety of new madhabs. This diversification was driven by the need to address local issues more effectively, leading to a rich tapestry of legal schools within Islamic jurisprudence. Today, I want to talk about the Hanafi madhab, which is one of the major Islamic schools of thought. The founder of this school is Imam Abu Hanifa, and interestingly, the madhab is actually named after him. Now, his real name was Nu'man ibn Thabit, but he's widely known as Abu Hanifa. His father was a silk merchant of Persian origin who accepted Islam, which played a role in Abu Hanifa's early cultural background. In his early years, Abu Hanifa started his studies in philosophy and dialectics, known as Ilm al-Kalam. This foundation in philosophy helped him develop a sharp and analytical mind. After mastering these disciplines, he moved on to study fiqh, the Islamic jurisprudence, and hadith, the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. His main teacher was Hamad ibn Zayd, who was considered one of the greatest scholars of hadith of his time. Abu Hanifa learned a lot from him, and during this period, he became qualified to teach others. However, he chose to stay as his teacher's student, showing his deep respect and dedication until Hamad ibn Zayd passed away. Once his teacher died, Abu Hanifa, at the age of 40, took on the role of a teacher himself. He became the most outstanding scholar in Kufa, a major city in Iraq. His knowledge and integrity made him highly respected. The Umayyad caliph saw his influence and offered him the position of judge of Kufa. But Abu Hanifa refused this position, even though it meant facing difficulties. He was beaten by the governor of Kufa, Yazid ibn Umar, for refusing. This story highlights his strong commitment to justice and independence in his scholarly and moral stance. Overall, Abu Hanifa's journey reflects his dedication to seeking knowledge, his principled character, and his lasting impact on Islamic jurisprudence. During the rule of the Abbasids, who were the third caliphate to succeed the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and who ruled Baghdad at that time, a significant event took place. He was offered a royal appointment, but he refused it again, demonstrating his commitment to his principles. Because of this refusal, he was imprisoned in Baghdad by the Caliph Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. He remained in prison until the end of his life, which shows his dedication and the challenges faced by scholars of that time. Now, let's talk about Abu Hanifa. He was considered among the followers and students of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. This is because he had the opportunity to meet some of the Sahaba and he related hadiths from them. His teaching method was quite unique for his time. He emphasized group discussion. He would present a legal problem to his students and encourage debate and discussion until they reached a solution. Once they did, he would tell them to record it, ensuring that knowledge was preserved and passed on accurately. Moving on to the sources of law used by the Hanafi madhab, the primary source is the Quran. It is considered unquestionable and the most authoritative. Any law or ruling that contradicts the Quran is simply unacceptable. The second most important source is the Sunnah, which includes the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. However, for a hadith to be used as a reliable source, it must be accurate and widely known because false hadiths were also circulated, and it was important to distinguish authentic narrations from fabricated ones. So, in summary, the Hanafi school relies mainly on the Quran and Sunnah, with careful attention to the authenticity of hadiths. This approach highlights the importance of both divine guidance and the traditions of the Prophet in Islamic law. Now, let's look at Ijma, specifically the consensus of the Sahaba. This means the unanimous opinion of the companions of the Prophet, especially when there's no specific mention of their agreement in the Quran or Sunnah. Ijma was considered superior to personal opinions, such as those of Abu Hanifa and his students. In fact, this madhab also recognized the validity and binding nature of the consensus of all Muslim scholars. Moving on to qiyas, or analogical reasoning. Abu Hanifa himself never felt compelled to accept the reasoning of the tabi'un, the students of the Sahaba, whenever there was no clear proof from the Quran or Sunnah. He saw himself as an equal to the tabi'un and would make his own ijtihad, independent legal reasoning, based on principles of qiyas that he and his students established. This shows how flexible and thoughtful the process of deriving laws was. Next, we have istihsan, which means preference. This is about choosing one proof over another because it seems more suitable to the specific situation. Interestingly, sometimes the preferred proof might even be weaker in terms of strict evidence. For example, it could involve favoring a particular hadith over a more general one, or choosing a law that better fits the context rather than strictly following qiyas. Then there's urf, or local custom. This was given legal importance, especially in areas where there was no established Islamic tradition. As a result, local cultural practices entered the Islamic legal system. Sometimes, these practices were mistaken for Islamic teachings themselves, which highlights how adaptable and inclusive the system could be, but also how careful we need to be in distinguishing cultural practices from religious obligations. Overall, these principles, ijma, qiyas, istihsan, and urf, show the richness and flexibility of Islamic jurisprudence. They allow us to interpret and apply Islamic teachings in diverse contexts while maintaining a core adherence to the fundamental sources. Let's talk about the main students of Abu Hanifa, the founder of the Hanafi madhab. First, we have Zafar ibn al-Hudhayl. He was known for following his teacher's example, refusing to accept the prestigious and attractive offers to become a judge. Instead, he chose to focus on teaching and continued doing so until his passing at the age of 42. Next is Abu Yusuf. He dedicated himself to studying hadith extensively, which helped him become a significant hadith scholar. After that, he studied fiqh under Imam ibn Layla, who was a well-known figure with a famous father, a Sahabi from Madinah. When Layla passed away, Abu Yusuf traveled to Madinah to study under Imam Malik, but only for a short period. Eventually, Abu Yusuf was appointed as a chief judge, and he also appointed other judges across different cities, all followers of the Hanafi madhab. Then we have Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. He studied hadith under Abu Hanifa himself and remained under his teacher's guidance until Abu Hanifa's death. After that, he continued his studies with Abu Yusuf, further deepening his knowledge. These students played vital roles in spreading and developing the Hanafi school of thought, each contributing in their own unique way. After his initial studies, he later traveled to Madinah, where he studied under Imam Malik for 3 years. During this time, he became one of the main narrators of Malik's hadith collection, Al-Muwatta. This was a significant contribution, as it helped preserve and transmit Imam Malik's teachings. Interestingly, Even Imam Shafi, another great scholar, studied under this student, highlighting the influence and respect he gained in the scholarly community. Hassan was offered a judge position, but he accepted it only to give it up soon after. The reason was the compromises and challenges that came with the role, which he found difficult to accept. Instead, he returned to his true passion, teaching. He resumed his teaching post in Baghdad, continuing to spread knowledge and Islamic jurisprudence. Now, when we look at the followers of the Hanafi madhab, they are mainly found across several regions. These include India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Beyond the Middle East, Hanafi followers are also present in the Caribbean and South America, such as Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname. To some extent, they are also found in Egypt. This geographic spread shows how influential and widespread the Hanafi school has become over centuries, shaping Islamic practice in many diverse communities. On this slide, we're looking at the Ottoman rulers of the 19th century and how they organized Islamic law during their time. They primarily followed the Hanafi madhab, which they officially adopted as the basis for the government's legal system. This meant that anyone who wanted to become a judge had to learn Hanafi jurisprudence, ensuring that the law was consistent and rooted in this school of thought. This policy played a major role in spreading the Hanafi madhab across the empire, making it the dominant legal tradition in the Ottoman realm. Now let's turn to the Maliki madhab, which is another important school of Islamic law. It was founded by Malik ibn Anas, who was born in Madinah, a city with deep religious significance. Malik's grandfather, Amir, was among the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, which gave Malik a noble lineage from the earliest generations of Islam. Malik studied under some of the greatest hadith scholars of his time, like Az-Zuri, and also learned from prominent hadith narrators, such as Nafi, who was a freed slave of a Sahabi. Interestingly, Malik's travels outside Madinah were very limited, mainly just for Hajj, so most of his knowledge was rooted in the religious and legal environment of Madinah itself. Because of this, his legal opinions were heavily influenced by what was available locally. There's an important incident worth noting. Malik was once severely beaten by the Amir of Madinah because he issued a legal ruling declaring that forced divorce was invalid. This shows how his interpretations sometimes challenged authorities, but also how deeply connected his rulings were to the community's realities. So, in summary, Malik's teachings and rulings contributed significantly to the Maliki madhab, which remains a vital school of Islamic law today. Malik's ruling directly challenged the practices of the rulers at that time, particularly the Abbasid rulers. These rulers had a custom of requiring an oath of allegiance from the people, which symbolized loyalty and commitment to them. However, there was a harsh clause attached. If someone broke this oath, they were automatically divorced from their position or allegiance. Malik argued that this practice was not acceptable from an Islamic perspective, and because of his stance, he was severely beaten. Despite this opposition, Malik continued to teach hadith in Madinah for over 40 years. During this time, he compiled a significant book that included the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, along with athars, statements of the Sahaba and their successors. He called this collection al-Muwatta, which translates as the beaten path, symbolizing a clear and straightforward guide. This compilation was actually done at the request of the Abbasid Caliph, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. The Caliph aimed to establish a complete legal code based on the Prophet's sunnah, his way of life, that could be consistently applied across his realm. Malik's work contributed greatly to that goal, providing a foundation for Islamic law grounded in authentic traditions. After completing his work, Malik refused to have the law imposed on the people by force. He believed that the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, had spread across the Islamic empire and carried with them important parts of the Sunnah. These parts, in his view, should be included in the law before it was officially established throughout the state. Even Caliph Harun ar-Rashid approached Malik with the same request, but he too was turned down. Malik's stance was rooted in his respect for the Sunnah and his desire to ensure it was properly integrated into the legal system. Malik passed away in Madinah, which was also his birthplace, at the age of 83. His teaching was fundamentally based on two key principles. First, the narration of hadiths, and second, the discussion of their meanings, especially in the context of the issues faced during his time. When Malik taught his students, he would often narrate hadiths and the athar, or statements of the Sahaba, covering various topics of Islamic law. But he didn't stop there. He would analyze their implications, asking questions and exploring how these sources applied to real problems in different regions. He would then narrate relevant hadiths or athar that could help solve those issues, making his approach both scholarly and practical. This method highlights his deep commitment to understanding the law in a way that was relevant and adaptable to the needs of the community. After finishing Al-Muwatta, Malik would often narrate it to his students, ensuring the knowledge was passed down accurately. Whenever he received new information, he would carefully add or subtract from it, making sure it aligned with his understanding. He was very strict about avoiding hearsay, gossip, rumors, or any assumptions in fiqh. This dedication to authenticity earned his school and followers the name al-Hadith, which means the people of Hadith. Now, regarding the sources of law Malik used, the Quran was his primary source. He used it without hesitation. The Sunnah came next in importance, but he, like Abu Hanifa, placed certain restrictions on its use. For instance, if a hadith was contradicted by the usual practice of the people of Madinah, he would reject it. However, unlike Abu Hanifa, he didn't require a hadith to be well-known or mashhur before applying it. He was open to using any hadith narrated to him, as long as it was transmitted by people who weren't known liars or had extremely weak memories. This approach highlights his emphasis on reliability and authenticity in sourcing Islamic law. All these points reflect his careful methodology, which aimed to preserve the integrity of Islamic jurisprudence and maintain a strong connection to authentic sources. Let's discuss the practices of the Madinites, or Amal of Madinah. Malik believed that the people of Madinah, being direct descendants of the Sahaba, held practices that were deeply rooted in the tradition of the Prophet's time. Since Madinah was where the Prophet, Piba, spent the last 10 years of his life, Malik saw these local practices as significant. He reasoned that practices common among the Madinites must have been allowed by the Prophet himself, since they were rooted in the community's way of life. Therefore, Malik accepted these practices as authentic sunnah, believing they were conveyed through deeds rather than just words. This shows how he valued the lived traditions of the community as part of religious practice. Now, moving on to the Amr of the Sahaba. Malik considered Amr, or consensus of the Sahaba, as the third most important source of Islamic law, after the Quran and Sunnah. He, like Hanifa, placed great importance on the agreement of the Sahaba, and he also extended this to include the consensus of later scholars. Malik fully accepted the opinions of individual Sahaba, even if they conflicted with each other or seemed to differ. You'll notice that he included these individual opinions in his famous book, Al-Muwatta. However, he prioritized the consensus of the Sahaba over individual opinions. When there was no agreement among the Sahaba, Malik would prefer the opinion of a single Sahaba over his own personal view. This approach underscores how Malik respected the collective understanding of the Prophet's companions, but also recognized that in the absence of consensus, individual Sahaba opinions could be valid. It's a nuanced way of balancing respect for tradition with scholarly reasoning, which fits into the broader theme of how Islamic law is developed through multiple sources and considerations. Now, let's look at qiyas, or analogy, which Malik used when he couldn't find a direct answer in the sources we discussed earlier. He would apply his own reasoning to address new or unclear issues. However, it's important to note that Malik was very cautious with this approach. He preferred to rely on established sources and authentic reasoning methods, so he didn't overuse analogy without careful consideration. Next, we have the custom of Madinites, which refers to the isolated practices of the people of Madinah. Malik considered these practices valid as long as they didn't contradict the Hadith. He believed that such customs were followed by earlier generations, including the Sahaba, or companions of the Prophet, Piba, and were thus acceptable and supported by tradition. Moving on to istisla, which is a form of reasoning that seeks the best interest or welfare. This concept is closely related to istihsan, developed by Hanifa, but Malik and his students called it istisla, meaning seeking what is more suitable. It involves cases where the Sharia might not have explicitly addressed a matter, but we can determine a beneficial ruling by considering human welfare. For example, Malik's use of istisla can be seen in the ruling of Caliph Ali, where he emphasized that even if only one person in a group committed a murder, the whole group could be held responsible. This shows how considerations of welfare and justice played a role in legal reasoning, especially when direct texts weren't available. Let's look at some important points about how Sharia approaches legal rulings. For example, Sharia specifically covers the ruling for the actual murderer, focusing on the act itself and its consequences. Another example involves the right of a Muslim leader to collect taxes from the wealthy if demanded by the state. However, Sharia only explicitly specifies zakah, which is a specific form of charity. This shows how the primary sources focus on particular aspects, while broader concepts might be interpreted or applied differently. Malik, one of the great scholars, also applied the principle of istisla, which is about reasoning laws that better serve current needs. This approach allows for adapting laws to new situations, making them more relevant and practical than relying solely on qiyas or analogy. Now, let's consider the concept of urf, or custom. Malik, much like Hanifa, placed importance on the social practices and habits of Muslims around the world. As long as these practices didn't contradict the core principles of Sharia, they could be considered a source of secondary law. This shows a flexible approach that respects local customs. Finally, talking about the main students of the Maliki madhab, those who didn't establish their own school, they include al-Qasim. He was born in Egypt but traveled to Madinah to study under Malik himself. He studied with Malik for more than 20 years and wrote an extensive book on the fiqh of the madhab called Mudawana. Interestingly, his work became even more comprehensive than Malik's own famous book, the Al-Muwatta. All these points highlight how the Maliki school developed a nuanced approach to law, balancing primary sources with local customs and current needs. Let's talk about Ibn Wahb. He traveled all the way from Egypt to Madinah to study under Malik. His dedication paid off because he became so skilled in deducting laws that Malik himself gave him a special title, al-Mufti, which means an official expounder of Islamic law. Interestingly, Wahb was offered a judge's position in Egypt, but he refused it. He chose to stay true to his principles and remain an independent scholar, valuing honesty above all. Now, Malik had other notable students too, some from different madhabs. This diversity of students led to the development of new madhabs. In fact, some students even created their own madhabs based on what they learned from Malik. For example, Muhammad ash-Shaybani was initially a student of Abu Hanifa, but others, like Muhammad ibn Idris ash-Shafi, studied under Malik for years and also learned from Muhammad ash-Shaybani, who was a student of Abu Hanifa. This shows how knowledge was shared and built upon, leading to the development of various madhabs, each with their own unique perspectives, but all rooted in the teachings of these great scholars. Followers of the Maliki madhab are primarily found in several key regions. You'll notice a strong presence in Upper Egypt and Sudan, where the Maliki school has historically been influential. Moving across North Africa, countries like Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco also have significant Maliki communities, which highlights how this madhab has shaped the religious landscape there. In West Africa, you'll see followers in countries such as Mali, Nigeria, and Chad, demonstrating the spread of Maliki teachings beyond North Africa into sub-Saharan regions. It's interesting to see how these communities have maintained their adherence over centuries, often blending local customs with Maliki jurisprudence. Additionally, the Arabian Gulf states, including Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain, also have notable Maliki adherents. This spread shows the geographic diversity of the madhab and its influence across different cultural and political contexts. Understanding where the Maliki madhab is followed helps us grasp the broader picture of Islamic jurisprudence and its regional variations. It's a key piece in understanding the historical and cultural dissemination of Islamic legal schools across the Muslim world. Let's now look at the Shafi'i Madhab, which was founded by the renowned scholar Muhammad ibn Idris ash-Shafi'i. He was born in Gaza, a city on the Mediterranean coast, which at that time was part of the region known as Sham. In his youth, he traveled to Madinah to pursue his studies, seeking knowledge from the best scholars of his time. There, he studied fiqh and hadith under Imam Malik, one of the great founders of Islamic jurisprudence. Ash-Shafi'i was so dedicated that he memorized Malik's entire book, Al-Muwatta, and could recite it from memory, a testament to his deep commitment and prodigious memory. He remained under Malik's mentorship until Malik's passing. After Malik's death, Ash-Shafi'i moved to Yemen, where he continued to teach and spread his understanding of Islamic law. However, his time in Yemen was not without challenges. He was accused of Shiite learnings and was brought before the Abbasid Caliph Harun ar-Rashid as a prisoner in Iraq. Ash-Shafi'i was able to demonstrate the correctness of his faith, which led to his release. Afterward, he stayed in Iraq and studied under Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, who was a prominent student of Abu Hanifa. Later, he traveled to Egypt with the hope of studying under Imam al-Layth. Unfortunately, by the time Ash-Shafi'i arrived there, al-Layth had already passed away. Nonetheless, he studied al-Layth's madhab through his students. Ash-Shafi'i stayed in Egypt until the end of his life, during the rule of Caliph al-Mamun. His journey reflects his dedication to seeking knowledge and shaping a school of thought that continues to influence us today. Let's explore the formation of the Shafi'i madhab. Shafi'i combined the fiqh of Hijaz, which was influenced by Maliki thought, with the fiqh of Iraq and Hanafi thought. This blending led to the creation of a new madhab, which he actively taught to his students. His teachings were primarily based on a book called Al-Hujjah, meaning the evidence, which he studied and taught in Iraq. Many of his students memorized this book and transmitted it to others, helping to spread his interpretation. This collection and his scholarship are often referred to as Al-Madhab al-Qadim, or the Old School of Thought. This helps distinguish it from his later period of scholarship. The second phase of his scholarship began after he reached Egypt. There, he learned the fiqh of Imam al-Layth ibn Sa'd, which introduced new perspectives. In this phase, he developed what is called al-Madhab al-Jadid, or the New School of Thought, which he taught through another significant work called Alam, meaning the essence. This new approach was based on discovering entirely new hadiths and applying fresh legal reasoning, which led him to overturn many rulings he had previously accepted while in Iraq. It's also important to highlight that Shafi'i was the first imam to systematically organize the core beliefs of fiqh, which he documented comprehensively in his famous book Ar-Risala. Overall, his contributions were groundbreaking, establishing a structured approach to fiqh that still influences us today. Let's take a closer look at the sources of law used by Shafi'i. Firstly, the Quran was his primary source. Just like other imams, he relied on it unquestionably. However, he didn't just accept it at face value. He deepened his understanding by studying the meanings of the Quran in detail. Moving on to the Sunnah, Shafi'i set a clear condition for accepting hadith: they must be authentic. Unlike some other scholars, he rejected additional conditions set by Imam Malik and Hanifa, focusing solely on authenticity. He was also renowned for his significant contributions to the science of hadith criticism, which helped determine the reliability of various hadiths. When it comes to Ijma, or consensus, Shafi'i had some doubts about its feasibility in many cases. He believed that true consensus was only possible in a few specific instances, and regarded Ijma as the third most important source of law. Regarding the opinions of individual Sahaba, he was quite accepting, provided these opinions didn't conflict with each other. If there was a disagreement among Sahaba, he would choose the opinion closest to the original source, much like Abu Hanifa did. Lastly, qiyas, or analogical reasoning, he saw as a valid method for deriving new laws, but he ranked it lower in importance compared to the other sources. He considered personal opinion less reliable than proofs based on the opinions of Sahaba. Overall, his approach was systematic, prioritizing the Quran, then authentic hadith, followed by consensus when possible, and finally reasoned analogy, always aiming for closeness to the original sources. Today, I want to talk about istishab, which means linking or connecting different situations in Islamic law. The Shafi'i school rejected this method, but it was used by Imam Hanafi as istihsan and by Imam Malik as istisla. These approaches were considered by some scholars as forms of bid'ah, or innovation, because they relied heavily on human reasoning, especially in areas where the laws were already revealed and established. However, it's important to note that when dealing with similar issues, these scholars often had to use the same sources as other imams, which led to the concept of istishab. The literal meaning of istishab is seeing a link, and legally, it refers to a process of reasoning where we connect current circumstances with past ones. The idea here is that fiqh laws are tied to certain conditions. They're valid as long as those conditions remain unchanged. If we're unsure whether a condition has altered, we can apply istishab to maintain consistency. For example, imagine a man has been absent for a long time, and we're unsure if he's alive or dead. According to istishab, we continue to assume he's alive and apply the relevant rules, unless we have certainty that he has passed away. This method helps us deal with uncertainties by linking current circumstances to previous ones, ensuring our rulings remain steady unless clear evidence suggests otherwise. Now, let's talk about the main students of Shafi'i and their significance. First, we have al-Muzani, whose full name is Ismail ibn Yahya al-Muzani. He was a constant companion of Shafi'i throughout his time in Egypt. Muzani is particularly renowned for writing a comprehensive book that carefully collected and organized Shafi'i's teachings. This book was later reduced and became known as Mukhtasar al-Muzani, which is considered one of the most widely read fiqh books within the Shafi'i madhab. Next, we have Ar-Rabi, or Ar-Rabi al-Muradi, who was the primary narrator of Shafi'i's famous text, Interestingly, he wrote down this book during Shafi'i's lifetime, which adds to its authenticity and importance. Ar-Rabi also authored other significant works, including Ar-Risala, further contributing to the development of the madhab. Finally, there's Yusuf ibn Yahya, also known as Yusuf ibn Yahya al-Buwaiti. He succeeded Shafi'i as the main teacher of the Shafi'i madhab. His story is quite tragic. He was imprisoned and tortured to death in Baghdad because he rejected the officially sanctioned Mu'tazilite philosophy, especially their view on the creation of the Quran. These students played vital roles in preserving, transmitting, and developing Shafi'i's teachings, helping to shape the madhab into what it is today. Now, let's take a look at the followers of the Shafi'i madhab. As we see, the majority of followers today are concentrated in several key regions. These include Egypt, which has historically been a center of Islamic scholarship, and southern Arabia, which has a rich tradition of Islamic learning and practice. Yemen and Hadramaut, in particular, are well known for their strong adherence to the Shafi'i school. Moving further east, we find significant communities in Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Malaysia, where Islamic teachings have deeply integrated into local cultures. In Africa, East African countries like Kenya and Tanzania also have sizable Shafi'i communities. Interestingly, the influence of the madhab extends even to South America, with followers in Suriname. What this distribution highlights is how the Shafi'i madhab has spread over centuries across diverse regions, adapting to local contexts while maintaining core principles. It's a great example of how Islamic jurisprudence can unify diverse communities. This regional spread is a key part of understanding the broader picture of Islamic legal traditions and their global reach. Today, I will talk about the Hanbali madhab, one of the four main Sunni schools of thought. The founder of this madhab was the renowned scholar Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal ash-Shaybani, who was born in Baghdad. He became one of the greatest memorizers and narrators of hadith of his time, dedicating much of his life to studying and preserving the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. His focus was primarily on the study of hadith, which he considered crucial for understanding Islamic law. Imam Ahmad also studied fiqh and hadith science under Imam Abu Yusuf, who was a famous student of Imam Abu Hanifa. Additionally, he sought knowledge from Imam Ash-Shafi'i, gaining a broad perspective on Islamic jurisprudence. However, his pursuit of knowledge was not without hardship. He faced many cruelties under the caliphs of his era, especially because he opposed their beliefs, specifically, their idea that the Quran was created, which aligns with Mu'tazilite philosophy. Because of this stance, Imam Ahmed was imprisoned and beaten for 2 years by order of Caliph Mamun. Despite these hardships, he was eventually set free and continued teaching in Baghdad. But when Caliph al-Wathik came to power, he repeated the same persecutions, forcing Imam Ahmed to cease teaching and go into hiding for 5 years. It was only after Caliph al-Mutawakkil took over that the situation improved. Al-Mutawakkil expelled the Mu'tazilite scholars and officially rejected their philosophy, which allowed Imam Ahmed to return to teaching openly. He continued to teach in Baghdad until his death, leaving behind a legacy of steadfastness and dedication to authentic Islamic teachings. His life exemplifies resilience in the face of opposition, and his contributions remain central to the Hanbali madhab and broader Islamic tradition. On this slide, we see how the Hanbali madhab was formed, and Ahmed's main concern was the collection, narration, and interpretation of hadith. His teaching method was quite unique. He would speak directly from his vast collection of hadiths. This collection is known as al-Musnad, which contains over 30,000 hadiths, including various opinions of the Sahaba and their interpretations. He would apply these hadiths or rulings to different existing problems, demonstrating how Islamic law is meant to be relevant and practical. If he couldn't find a hadith or an existing opinion on a particular issue, he would offer his own opinion. However, an important point is that he forbade his students from recording his personal opinions, emphasizing reliance on authentic sources. Interestingly, the madhab wasn't recorded directly by Ahmad's students, but by their students, and it developed through their teachings. Now, regarding the sources of law used by the Hanbali school, the Quran is of course the primary source, just as it is for other schools, but Hanbali scholars gave it the highest priority. The Sunnah comes next as a second important source. A key principle in this school's approach is that any legal ruling must be marfu, meaning directly attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. This emphasis on authentic, direct attribution ensures that rulings are rooted firmly in the Prophet's teachings. Let's talk about the Aima of the Sahaba, or the consensus of the Prophet's companions. Imam Ahmed held a strong view here. He accepted the agreed-upon opinions of the Sahaba and placed it as the third most important source after the Quran and Sunnah. This shows how much he valued their understanding and agreement. He was also quite clear in discrediting claims of Aima outside the era of the Sahaba, considering such claims to be inaccurate. His reasoning was that during the time of the Sahaba, the number of scholars was smaller, and their teachings circulated widely within the Muslim empire, making their consensus more reliable and attainable. Imam Ahmed believed that after the era of the Sahaba, it became impossible to achieve a true Aima because of the vast number of scholars and differing opinions that emerged. This highlights his cautious approach to collective consensus beyond the companions. Now, when it comes to individual opinions of the Sahaba, Imam Ahmed was quite flexible. If the Sahaba had conflicting opinions on a matter, he would accept all of them, much like Imam Malik did, recognizing that different companions might have valid perspectives. This flexibility allowed for the development of various rulings within the madhab, addressing different issues with nuance. Moving on to weak hadith, Imam Ahmed preferred to rely on these only when no other sources provided a solution. He would accept weak hadith rather than resort to personal reasoning, or qiyas, as long as certain conditions were met. The hadith should not be narrated by a fasik, someone known for corrupt conduct, or a kadhib, a known liar. This shows his cautious approach, using weak hadith only when necessary and ensuring their credibility. So, in summary, Imam Ahmed's approach to sources was nuanced. He valued the consensus of the Sahaba, was cautious about claims of Aima outside their era, accepted multiple opinions when there was disagreement, and used weak hadith carefully, always prioritizing the integrity of the sources. Qiyas, or analogy, was used as a last resort by Ahmed when no clear evidence or opinion could be directly applied. In those cases, he would reason a solution based on one or more of the previous principles, essentially drawing parallels to arrive at a judgment. When we look at his main students within the Hanbali school, we see his own two sons, Sali and Abdullah, who continued his teachings. Additionally, some of the most renowned scholars of Hadith, like Imam Bukhari and Muslim, studied under Ahmed and produced the most outstanding collections of Hadith. Their work has greatly influenced Islamic scholarship. As for Hanbali followers today, the majority are found in regions like Palestine and Saudi Arabia. These areas continue to uphold and practice the principles of the Hanbali madhab, maintaining the traditions that Ahmed established. This slide highlights the importance of qiyas as a tool in Islamic jurisprudence, especially when direct evidence isn't available, and it underscores the lasting influence of Ahmed and his students in shaping the Hanbali school of thought across different regions. The Hanbali madhab, which was once widespread across the Muslim world, eventually died out in many regions. However, it survived in Saudi Arabia, primarily because Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi revivalist movement, had studied under scholars of the Hanbali madhab. Because of his deep knowledge, he adopted the Hanbali madhab as the basis for his movement, without seeking formal approval, but because he found it aligned with his teachings. Later, Abdulaziz ibn Sa'd captured most of the Arabian Peninsula and established the Saudi dynasty. He made the Hanbali madhab the foundation of the country's legal system, which has had a lasting impact even today. It's important to clarify a common misconception. Many people believe that following a madhab means you can't refer to or question other madhabs. But in reality, the four imams, who are the founders of these madhabs, never said such a thing. Their teachings encourage seeking knowledge and understanding, not blind adherence. Today, we have unprecedented access to resources and information. Back then, scholars traveled great distances, facing hardships like limited water, food, extreme heat, and difficult travel conditions to collect hadiths. Mistakes could happen during transmission. Hadiths could be misheard or misremembered, or people might falsely claim certain practices were Islamic to spread incorrect beliefs. Sometimes, people simply forgot or misunderstood parts of the tradition. So it's crucial to remember that our knowledge today is built on a long history of diligent scholarship, but also that errors in transmission were possible. That's why ongoing learning and verification are so important in understanding Islam. Today, I want to highlight the approach of the four learned imams, starting with Abu Hanifa. He once told one of his students, Yaqub, "Woe be on you, Yaqub! Do not write down all you hear from me, for surely I may hold an opinion today and leave it tomorrow, hold another tomorrow and leave it the day after." This shows his humility and recognition that human opinions can change. He discouraged his students from recording every opinion he shared, mainly to prevent blind imitation. He didn't want followers to accept his views without understanding their basis. Abu Hanifa also emphasized that no one should follow or make rulings based on his opinions unless they knew the sources and proofs behind them. His student reported that Abu Hanifa said, "It is forbidden for anyone who does not know my proofs to make a ruling according to my statements, for we are only humans. We may say something today and reject it tomorrow." This underscores the importance he placed on knowledge, evidence, and humility in legal rulings. He clearly defined the ultimate criteria for what is right and wrong as being the Quran and Sunnah. He famously said, "If I have made a ruling which contradicts Allah's book or the messenger's Piba hadith, reject my ruling." This highlights the primacy of divine guidance over human opinion. Furthermore, Abu Hanifa stressed that anyone following his madhab must accept sound hadith. He stated, "If a hadith is found to be sahih, it is my madhab," meaning authentic hadith take precedence over personal or scholarly opinions. In summary, these points reflect his humility, dedication to authentic sources, and the importance of adhering to divine revelation. These principles are central to our overall understanding of how Islamic jurisprudence should be approached, always prioritizing the Quran and Sunnah above all. Let's take a closer look at the four learned imams, starting with Imam Malik. He was known for his humility and openness to change. Whenever he encountered new evidence from a reliable source, he didn't hesitate to revise his rulings, even if he had spoken differently in public before. For instance, his main student, Ibn Wahb, once quoted him about washing between the toes during wudu. Malik initially said that people don't have to do it, but after waiting until most people left, Ibn Wahb informed him about a hadith concerning this act. When Malik heard the details, he acknowledged it was a good hadith that he had never come across before. This moment was pivotal. Malik then began advising people to wash between their toes, showing his willingness to accept new evidence and correct his opinions. It's important to note that Malik emphasized he was fallible. His rulings were not infallible. He maintained that only those rulings consistent with the Quran and Sunnah should be followed. Malik famously said, "Verily I am only a man, I err and am at times correct. So thoroughly investigate my opinions, then take whatever agrees with the book and Sunnah, and reject whatever contradicts them." This statement clearly shows he did not want his followers to adhere rigidly to his opinions alone. Furthermore, Malik acknowledged that there are many authentic hadiths not found in his collection. Because of this, he turned down the opportunity to have his madhab declared the official legal school of the Islamic State. Overall, Malik's approach was characterized by humility, continuous learning, and a focus on the Quran and Sunnah rather than rigid adherence to his own opinions. Let's look at the insights from Imam Shafi, one of the four learned imams. Like his teacher Malik, Imam Shafi believed that at his time, it was not possible for anyone to be fully aware of all the hadith narrated by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He recognized that remembering every single hadith was simply beyond human capacity. Because of this limitation, he acknowledged that scholars could make mistakes in their judgments. Imam Shafi famously said that no one among us has not had a son of Allah's messenger slip past their memory or elude them. This means that any ruling or principle they propose could, in some way, be contrary to what the Prophet, Piba, said. He emphasized that the correct ruling must align with what Allah's messenger, Piba, actually said. This is a key point. The ultimate authority is the sunnah of the Prophet. Imam Shafi also pointed out that Muslims of his time unanimously agreed that if someone encounters an authentic sunnah, they are not allowed to disregard it in favor of someone else's opinion. This strict adherence to the authentic sunnah is why Imam Shafi, after writing his famous book Al-Hujjah, decided to write a new book called Alam. He had traveled to Egypt and learned new things from Imam al-Layth, and this fresh knowledge contributed to his ongoing efforts to understand and interpret the sunnah correctly. So overall, Imam Shafi's approach underscores the importance of respect for the sunnah, recognizing human limitations, and the need to continually seek knowledge to uphold the truth of Islam. Let's talk about Imam Hanbal, also known as Ahmed, and how he carried forward the tradition of his teacher, Imam Shafi. Unlike some scholars who encouraged their students to highly respect sources of Islam but still allowed for flexible interpretation, Hanbal emphasized a different approach. He actually discouraged his students from recording his opinions, which is quite interesting. This is why his madhab, or school of thought, wasn't written down until the next generation, his students, and then their students. Imam Hanbal famously advised, "Do not blindly follow my rulings, those of Malik, al-Shafi, al-Awza'i, or ath-Thawri. Take your rulings from whence they took theirs." This highlights his emphasis on relying directly on the sources of Islam rather than just following scholarly opinions blindly. He also expressed that the opinions of scholars like al-Awza'i, Malik, and Abu Hanifa are simply opinions, and to him, they are all equal. What truly matters, he said, is the hadiths of the Prophet, peace be upon him. This shows his strong preference for hadiths over human opinions, even preferring a weak hadith over a deduced ruling if it aligns with the hadith. Imam Hanbal warned strongly against disregarding the hadith of the Prophet, Piba. He famously said, "Whoever rejects an authentic hadith of the Prophet, Piba, is on the verge of destruction," emphasizing how crucial it is to uphold the authentic teachings of our Prophet. Overall, Hanbal's approach underscores the importance of the Hadith as the primary source of Islamic law, reinforcing the idea that our reliance should be on the authentic teachings of the Prophet, peace above all else. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. I want to thank you all for your time and attention. Remember, the insights and strategies we've discussed are designed to help you grow and succeed. The CLD Institute is here to support you every step of the way. So, as you move forward, keep these key concepts in mind and apply them confidently. Thank you again for being part of this journey. I look forward to seeing what you achieve next.